Olivia, can you please introduce your panel for us? Thank you and good luck.
Thank you very much, Fiona. It's great to be here today, and it's great to be here discussing domestic work and care, which has been, until very recently, largely left out of the literature and the debate on the gig economy. I have three great panelists with me. So I've got Ayush Ratzi, who's a senior researcher at the Center for Internet and Society. I can only see myself at the moment. If we could see all four of us, that would be wonderful. Ayush has done extensive research together with colleagues at CIS on platforms in domestic work and care in India, dating back as far as 2018. So him and his colleagues have done some pioneering, groundbreaking research on this topic in India, and it's great to have you on board today. So warm welcome to you, Ayush. And then we also have with us Feroz Muyaji, coordinator of the Social Law Project at the Faculty of Law, Western Cape in South Africa. Very warm welcome to you, Feroz. I can see you on screen. It's also great to have you with us because I'm sure you're going to bring us a really interesting perspective from your experience as one of the driving forces behind the We Care digital platform cooperative, which is the first of its kind in South Africa. The Platform Cooperative project has more than 60 domestic workers as members, and you are at the moment piloting in 2 cities. So it's great to have you on board. Welcome. And then we have Julia Tacona, who's assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School of Communication. Very warm welcome to you, Julia. Also one of the pioneers, in this case in the United States, one of the first researchers to study the impact of the rise of the gig economy in domestic work and care, with the first study that you did in 2018 together with your colleague at Data and Society, Alexandra Matescu. So great to have you on board. More recently, Julia's published a book called Left to Our Own Devices, where she looks at the role of digital technologies and their impact in the life of especially precarious workers. So that goes way beyond the gig economy, and we could do a whole other webinar on just that subject. So thank you very much for being here today. And so as we've heard from Claire in her presentation, she's given us a great overview of the state of the domestic work and care sector across the world. And as she mentioned, there are many intermediaries, there are many different actors involved in facilitating and providing work for workers and providing workers for clients. So let's zoom in this panel to look at the impact that the gig economy is having in this sector. And we'll ask, the first question I want to ask the panelists, I want to ask them if they can help us paint a picture. We've had that global perspective. So now let's paint the picture of what the gig economy looks like in the domestic work care sectors in the United States, in India, in South Africa. How big are the platforms? Are they large? Are they small? How long ago did they start? Do they intermediate mostly in cleaning services, also care? What can you tell us? And let's start with you, Julia.
Great. Thank you so much, Olivia. And thanks to Claire also for that wonderful introduction. I can't wait to dig into those numbers. If I also just wanted to say, like, if you had told me a couple of years ago that we would be on this panel where we would be talking only about domestic work and platforms, I would have, like, you would have been able to push me over with a feather, because I think, you know, it wouldn't have happened. So I think that's, it's really, it speaks really highly of Wage Indicator. It speaks really highly of, you know, the way that these conversations are evolving globally to include domestic workers in conversations about the platform economy or the gig economy. So just, you know, wonderful. And I'm so excited to be here and share space with these other amazing researchers. So what I kind of wanted to do first was to kind of set the stage in terms of setting up the context of these companies and these apps into their kind of proper economic and political context, right? And again, I'm researching from the United States. That's kind of where I'm coming from. Well, I'm sure we'll get into, you know, there's different global varieties of capitalism, but it is capitalism that we're talking about here for the most part. And, you know, there's a reason why platforms have been proliferating in domestic work specifically, especially in the United States. It's because they're exploiting what's already there, right? There isn't this kind of Oftentimes, we hear platform companies narrating what they do in terms of disruption, but it's really important, especially as researchers, as academics, as I am on this issue, to emphasize and to keep looking for the continuities in these conditions, right? Despite what these companies are saying or kind of underneath what they're doing. This isn't just true in domestic work, as Fiona mentioned, that great quote from Ai-jen Poo from the National Domestic Workers Alliance, right? That domestic workers are the original gig workers, right? So there's not a whole lot that's new in terms of the employment relationships that we're seeing here. But I would say this isn't actually just true in domestic work. It's also true of other kinds of platform work as well. It's just particularly instructive or obvious in domestic work in a way that maybe it's a bit more buried in other kinds of work. So I actually argue what we're doing here by investigating these workers is actually instructive for everybody else as well. So I encourage you to kind of think about that as well. Domestic work is a case where the dynamic of gig economy companies borrowing from what's already there in these labor market sectors. In the case of domestic work, it's rampant informality. It's that, domestic workers are often working through what we call labor market intermediaries or kind of brokers of their labor, right? Whether that's agencies, kind of employment agencies or contract firms, they're used to that, right? And so what platform companies are doing is not that much different on the surface than that. Although in the particulars, it is different and there are new challenges, right? So even though I'm kind of emphasizing this continuity, that isn't to say that there aren't lots of new and very thorny challenges that we have to meet, that workers have to meet, that worker organizers and advocates have to meet, and have been meeting for many, many years, to have been meeting for a long time in the past as well. And I should say Dawn Gerhardt is on the next panel, and so she is more than able to talk to the work of the National Domestic Workers Alliance and other domestic worker organizing that's been happening since the very beginning to meet these challenges and many others. However, the current landscape of these apps in the United States, I should say my expertise is specifically in thinking about care work, although I'm happy to talk about domestic cleaning as well. I would say, care.com in the United States is the biggest. It's the kind of Amazon of care, right? And I say that laughingly because actually the two companies are a bit more integrated than they used to be. So even though care.com is the biggest, Amazon is actually offering care.com services to many of its employees now also. So one of the reasons why care.com has become so big is not only because it has a lot of workers registered to work on its platform, but also because it is becoming ever more integrated with some of the United States' largest employers. So it's selling its services, which are often integrated into employees' benefits packages, on the employment side. So we're actually seeing it really expand on the client side as well as on the worker side. However, there are some other larger players, Urban Sitter, Sitter City, or some other kind of national brands in terms of what's at play in the United States, but it's also very regional, right? So there's some local alternatives depending on where you live. And it's also important to note that Facebook is an extremely important platform where workers in the United States, care workers especially, are getting their jobs, but it is not a quote unquote labor platform, although I would argue it is actually a labor platform. So it's important to kind of think about when we use this term platform or gig economy, that there are a lot of other places on the internet where workers are getting their job that are not specifically just these dedicated apps and websites, right? So I just kind of want to leave it there to start.
Thanks a lot, Julia. That's great. What about you, Ayush? What can you tell us about the landscape in your part of the world?
Touching upon a little bit of what Julia was talking about, right? We see a lot of that in the Indian context as well, is that there's been a history of sort of intermediaries that have sort of connected domestic workers with employers, right? And these traditional intermediaries are notorious for a bunch of problematic and downright harmful practices in how they go about doing this. And I mean, it's precisely within this genealogy almost that I see sort of domestic work platforms coming into the Indian context as well, right? And I think for me, so why it's been so important to look at domestic work platforms specifically, right? And it's me going back back to 2018, 2019, when we had started thinking about this work, was that, I mean, one was to sort of, build a certain heterogeneity to how we are thinking about gig work, right? Back then, and even today, I think like a large part of what we talk about gig work often refers to ride sharing platforms or food delivery platforms and so on. And I mean, this sort of thinking is so pervasive that it's even finding its way into the sort of policy making lexicon, right? And I think sort of just adding this nuance in there, right? So again, I mean, just as sort of a bit, just as like sort of a high level sort of contrast, I mean, it's both sort of food delivery and sort of driving work continues to be like a male dominated work, right? And it's organized differently when compared to domestic work, which is largely which is overrepresented by women workers, really. So I think like that's been like an important point of sort of divergence for us and for me specifically in sort of talking about domestic work and platformization specifically, and also relatedly, I think given the kind of sort of variations in digital access, digital literacy in the country, what we've also seen is that the almost hegemonic ideas of what a digital platform looks like in this space, like, or what a gig work platform looks like, which is typically sort of contrasted or sort of we use Uber as an analogy often, but that's not really the case when it comes to domestic work, right? There are other ways in which platforms have come up. These needn't necessarily be all what we call on-demand platforms, but also platforms that act pretty much as like databases, really, which help which serve the job of connecting sort of workers with like final employers. So when we start thinking about platforms then as researchers, as policymakers, as users, perhaps, I think there's like a lot to unpack over here. And I mean, it's becoming more relevant with sort of, I would say, every passing day, and especially sort of was accelerated by COVID-19. And I mean, as sort of both were alluded to in like the introduction and the keynote as well. And I think it's just sort of impossible to not talk about domestic work anymore in the context of platform work. And just like a final note is also that domestic work is it's not that platforms have come into like domestic work as it used to sort of be structured and used to operate, but also is sort of reframing domestic work in interesting ways. And perhaps later in the panel, I would sort of, I would like to talk about that a little bit, and maybe we can sort of think about what it could look like in the future. Yeah.
Thanks. I'd like to move on to Feroz now. What can you tell us? What does the landscape look like in South Africa?
Thanks, Olivia. Yes, I'm not going to repeat and what the other speakers have already confirmed in terms of the continuity of the kind of gendered and exploitative nature of domestic work and how it continues. It's kind of into a sort of situation of super exploitation with platforms. If one were to look at, in South Africa, we saw platforms sort of emerging around 2014, quietly, slowly emerging around 2014. And it was maybe around 2018 when they became a lot more visible, compared to previous years when it was just a fairly quiet sort of feeling their way into the market kind of situation. So what we have in South Africa are a few small localized platforms and then one monopoly, if I can call it that, and they've dominated the scene. But I think what's really interesting about the kind of dominant platform in South Africa is the fact that they haven't quite reached the kind of scale, even though they're getting all this investment into the company. And, you know, earlier in the process, as platforms were emerging, you know, there was a lot of excitement. There was a lot of excitement among employers, among other workers about the possibilities that platforms held out for people in terms of access. And it became quite an issue around 2018, I think, with the first Uber case, when Uber was actually challenged by 7 workers who had been deactivated. And I think that also brought the whole idea of what people thought platforms were really intended to do, that it actually wasn't fulfilling that intention of, one, providing access. So the largest platform with still only reaches less than 1% of domestic workers in the country, yet they fare very well in terms of rating by, you know, according to Fair Work ratings. Also, they do very well because it's quite easy, but, you know, from where we're sitting, it's quite easy to do very well in terms of rating. If you look at what the minimum wage is for domestic workers on the one hand, and at the same time, you know, domestic work is, there's just like one, there are no pay grades. It's just like one wage for domestic workers. It's not rated or, you know, job graded according to specialization, according to care work. And as far as I, you know, have observed, besides the grading of the work, which hasn't developed over the years, it's also been very much devalued through what seems like fragmentation of the sector also, and separating out at some levels, even though care work is also covered in Convention 189 and our local Basic Conditions of Employment Act and the sectoral determination specifically for domestic workers as well. But care work and cleaning have been kind of separated. And what the platforms are offering, the majority of platforms offer cleaning services. And again, it's the devaluing of gendered domestic care. So it's separated and further devalued just to include cleaning services. And so why is there such a proliferation of agencies, big and small?
Sorry, Fayrouz, if I can just stop you there, because I think that's really interesting, that last point, and I'd like for us to move on, if that's okay, to the question around motivations. Why are women turning to platforms to find work? You know, until now, one of the main ways of finding work in this field is through word of mouth. What benefits, what opportunities are platforms providing for workers? And if we could just quickly go around the room, that would be great. So maybe Fayrouz, you can start by answering that question.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, what seems to be playing itself out is the idea of access. And I think I've mentioned that earlier also. It's the idea of access. But I think, so, you know, I think domestic workers, like all other workers, have realized, and also with COVID, the impact of COVID, the kind of the push to digitalization has also included domestic workers. They've not been excluded from that. And I think, you know, just the idea of flexible work, the idea of access is what has driven this sort of fluid sector, has driven domestic workers into platform work, and also job losses. So this is one way in which workers can sort of make up for lost time, They may, they work 5 days a week. We've heard earlier also it's about domestic work being the original gig work. So yes, you work for 5 employers, 5 different days. So you lose 2 days. And so the platform becomes a lever. It becomes a mechanism for you to make up those days, or at least the idea of that sort of access. I've hogged the floor. I will hand over to one of the other panelists.
Thanks, Feroz. That's great.
Thank
what about
you?
Thank you. Ayush, what are you finding in your research? You've had a chance to speak to many workers across the last few years. What are you finding? What's the main drive?
Absolutely. So word of mouth continues to be one of the predominant sort of ways in which domestic workers find work, right? And and these platforms are coming in this context and have been particularly, and in terms of the workers that we spoke to, sort of several of them were at sort of points in life, and sort of borrowing a term that Julia had used in one of our pre-panel conversations, which were at like, important transitions in their lives, right? So, for example, they were first-time migrants into a city and did not have the kind of networks that could be useful, that would be useful for them to sort of secure some work, or they were recently separated from their partners and wanted a source of income and did not have the traditional sort of word of mouth networks that could help them secure a job. So these were sort of two important points in time in sort of women's lives that they often sought sort of digital platforms as one of many routes in which they could seek domestic work. But what was sort of very important and pertinent to look at is that many a times that is not how they ultimately ended up finding work, right? And this is something also Feroz does mention at times, is that do these platforms really work? And this was the case with women workers. We also sort of spoke to a fair bit of male workers who've been providing cleaning services. And for a lot of them, the ideas of entrepreneurship, the ideas of professionalism that are sort of marketed and parroted by platforms and sort of packaged in these very interesting ways tend to be like a sort of major draw for many of them. So I'll stop there and just hand over to Julia.
Thank you, Julia.
That's a perfect segue. Thank you. You're just like setting it up for me perfectly there. So to talk to like the current data, right? Interviews with care workers today. These transitions in workers' lives provide a really important motivator for, a worker who may not or may have been reticent or skeptical of the platforms kind of to begin with, a more veteran care worker to kind of finally register and put a profile up, and even to seek help from younger care workers. I also should say, I apologize, I have a very noisy toddler who's currently getting ready to go to school. So I think you might hear some ambulance noises in the background right now. The other thing to kind of point out, again, to just kind of go back to what Ayush was saying about this like package of, or this branding of like professionalism, this veneer of professionalism, which is a really important value, right, for many of these workers, and a really important motivation for why they might sign up in the first place. Just to widen that out a little bit in kind of thinking about in my context in terms of care workers, the thing that I see most often is the offer of control, honestly. So domestic workers, care workers, especially in the United States, are used to having to deal with, as I said before, labor market intermediaries, right? So we keep saying word of mouth, the word of mouth job search, but that makes it sound as if it's unmediated, right? That there's just like, oh, it's just the worker, and we just happen to find the perfect client for that worker through, social networks or something like that. But of course, these word of mouth searches are also mediated through people's social networks and through other kinds of labor brokers, even if they don't see themselves as labor brokers, right? Different kinds of, social hubs within the community or something like that, where workers are operating or where they're looking to get a job. And in the US, it's important to kind of name the conditions that have shaped what these informal labor brokers look like in the past. And in the United States, that's chattel slavery, indentured servitude, and wage bondage or debt bondage, right? And so those were the employment conditions, the employment relationships that shaped what these ultimately what these labor market intermediaries, informal or formal, looked like in the United States, and that continue to shape in some forms the conditions that workers face in the United States today. And so when these platforms come about, when workers make the choice to engage with them, what they're offering them, in addition to this, kind of thinking about professionalism and this like very this nice way of presenting their CV, right? Their experiences, their profile photo, right? It's like very neat and tidy and standard way of showcasing their skills and their talents, is this offer of control over who they work for, which is not something that domestic workers in the US have been able to be assured of, right? Historically, they were not able to control who they were working for, and still are not able to control who they're working for in a lot of cases. So I think thinking about that from the perspective of workers and the allure of that from platforms, and I should say it's not always a false allure, right? In some ways, platforms do offer control over who their clients are in really meaningful ways to workers these days. That's also an important thing to kind of think about in the context of what's motivating workers to continue engaging with these sites.
Thank you, Julia. That's really interesting. So life transitions, as Ayush pointed out, and perhaps arriving in a new city and having to find quickly new clients, and also this sense of having a greater sense of control over who you're working with. They're two important potential benefits of working for platforms. But now let's turn to the last question that I have for you, which is, if you could think of what are, from your experience talking to workers, what have they transmitted? What would you say the top 3 challenges that they have, or what are the things? Yes, what are the challenges, or what are the obstacles, or what are the perhaps the not so good side of working for platforms, before we then lead into the best practice section? Julie, if you'd like to continue on that thought and answering that question.
Sure. Yeah. I think talking to workers on the worker side, that one of the biggest problems that they mentioned first and foremost, and I should say this is coming from both interviewing with individual domestic workers or care workers, but also kind of domestic work organizations, other kinds of collectives, unions, other types of collectivities of domestic workers as well, is pay. Right? It's wages. There's the sense that when platforms become, and I should say, I'm talking now about the dedicated apps and platforms, things like care.com and Urban Sitter, Sitter City, that when platforms kind of become more dominant within a particular city, that it appears as if the wages are depressed, right? Especially to those veteran care workers who are used to being able to command higher wages, right? They have the sense that clients start to have lowered expectations for what they can pay. I will say that in my kind of, observations of what's been going on Facebook, which is also a platform where these things are being organized, where jobs are being had, and where information, importantly, is being exchanged among workers, that there is a kind of counterbalance, right? There's a pushback against the lowering of wages by this attempt by more organized kind of groups of workers that have Facebook groups that are mostly for domestic workers, for care workers in my case only, to say this is the wage you should be working for in this city, right? They're usually local. They're usually made up of folks who are looking for work or looking to meet up at playgrounds and things like that. And there is more of a asking for a read on whether things are fair, right? So that workers will kind of come there and say, hey, I just got this job offer. What do you guys think of this? And there will be some mentoring around wages, right, in that conversation. And it's still obviously up to the individual care worker whether they accept that job or not at different wages. But I have noticed that as a kind of, in my opinion, a positive kind of countervailing trend of the labor platforms, which really isolate and atomize workers from one another and don't really allow that kind of mentoring or that kind of sense of what's normal within a particular city. And I think, Olivia, you wanted us to save kind of talking about what are the challenges that we're not talking about yet. So I won't get into that yet, but wages are the big challenge that I hear a lot about.
Thanks, Julie. And I'm sure that Dawn will be able to tell us, give us a lot of information about the way that workers are organising in the United States when we get onto the best practice section. Feroz, what would be the top challenge that workers are expressing to you, and how is the platform cooperative in that sense, counterbalancing that?
Look, I'm not sure whether the platform cooperative is balancing that, but the two key challenges I think that we've encountered with platform domestic workers. The one would be the lack of social protection. And in fact, there's a kind of, I suppose, it's been further marginalized with platform workers because, you know, as prior to platform work, you know, they are domestic workers are very well covered, even though there's a problem with the implementation, which Claire also spoke to. So while there's a problem and challenges with implementation of social protection, at least there was the coverage. Whereas with platform work, a woman falls pregnant, what happens? You are deactivated from the platform. So just as basic as that. So I think that there's a kind of, there's a reduction in terms of social protection, you know, with a kind of misclassification of workers as independent contractors. So while it would appear that wages are higher, it's higher than the minimum wage, but other protections are kind of reduced. So for us, two key challenges are, the second one being people not having enough gigs. So you just don't get enough work. So you sign up and, you know, I've spoken to workers who have been on the platform, I'm talking the big platform now, for more than a year with not getting one single gig. And, you know, so look, I'm sure there are the benefits, but in terms of challenges, just not enough work coming through. And so talking cooperatively, I mean, we'd like to believe that, you know, when we start rolling out our platform, there'd be a different kind of algorithmic management, which allows for sharing of jobs. So, you know, so that even if there are fewer jobs, that can be shared among workers and not the same people getting the same amount of work to the exclusion of the bulk of workers who are sitting there. And one just wonders, what is it that keeps, what's behind what is it that we're not talking about? Because data is, you know, data costs, data transactions generate income, but for who? And I think, you know, we need to begin to look at that as a big challenge. Yeah. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Feroz. And Ayush, any final thoughts on this? What are the key challenges that you've?
Wages certainly sort of tops the list, right? And within that, I just want to sort of briefly mention two aspects of how wages are thought of and received, really. And one of the, I mean, sort of the big complaint is always commission, right? Is the commission charged by platforms? It's all, I mean, workers find it very hard to justify why platforms charge the commissions that they do, right? And there is like so much fine print sort of encoded in workers' contracts to prevent working outside of the platform with the client. So commission rates and sort of within wages as well is sort of the kind of costs that they have, kind of costs that are outsourced to platforms, right? Costs of like equipment, costs of waiting time, and all, I mean, and sort of just the cost of sort of buying uniforms, cost of buying basically the tools of the trade, really, and sort of mandatory prescriptions around what these tools should look like and how and the ways in which you have to sort of present yourself, the kind of trainings that they have to get into. So there's like a bunch of unpaid and costly sort of time and sort of material that workers have to sort of take on to be able to work with platforms. And sort of the other sort of broader framing that I sort of like to use and probably will be hearing a lot about later today is that platforms are simply designed to optimize sort of one side of the market's experience, right? The customers experience, and that is a big one. It captures a lot of aspects of how platforms work. So the rating systems is like a big one. Really, it's pretty one-sided, and related to that really is a grievance redressal, and that for me is a big one. Like workers find it, worker safety tends to be prioritized much lower than customer safety. There's no way to challenge decisions taken by the platform, especially given especially given the power dynamic really that is at play here, and sort of relatedly also the kind of regulatory void that platforms operate in, right? That there is an absence of grievance redressal mechanisms beyond the platform, also outside the platform too. So I think sort of the sheer helplessness of having, let's say, an untoward incident while working for a platform is like potentially debilitating and crippling with no way out really, and that continues to be like a constant threat and an almost intentional sort of intentional design and business choice, or like a managerial choice really adopted by platforms to sort of continue exercising the kind of control that they do. So yeah,
yeah. Thanks. So I think it's we'll leave it there for now and lead on to the next part of the webinar, which will feel more uplifting because it's two very inspiring stories and case studies. So over to Fiona. Thank you very much, Ayush, Julia, and Feroz.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.